Delaney Ashford could dismiss an executive with a single nod, but that evening she was not permitted to leave the table. Her phone had been taken, the exit was monitored, and placed before her was an agreement that would hand her empire to the man smiling at her side. When the server turned away, Delaney pressed her pen to the linen napkin and wrote a single word, "Help." The napkin slipped to the floor. Owen Barrett, a single father at table 15, bent down and retrieved it before anyone else could, and understood in that instant that he had stepped into a conspiracy worth several $billion. If you believe one act of courage can shake an entire empire, stay with Owen until the very end. Owen Barrett had not planned to stay at Calder House that evening, but the client who had called him downtown to discuss a franchise agreement had canceled 30 minutes before their scheduled time, and Owen, who had already paid for parking and worn the only jacket he kept pressed, decided the deposit on the table reservation was not worth wasting. He ordered the salmon because it was the least expensive entree that would not embarrass him in a room where the servers wore white gloves, settled into the chair at table 15 with a contract file he no longer needed, and let his eyes move through the half-lit dining room the way they always did in unfamiliar spaces, cataloging exits, posture, and the small details that most people never thought to notice. He had spent 11 years reading documents for a living, and somewhere in that decade he had developed the same habit with rooms. Everything left a record if you knew where to look. The semi-private dining area on the far side of the floor was separated from the main hall by a paneled screen and a curtained archway, and through the gap Owen could see 3 people at a round table positioned away from the windows. He recognized the woman immediately, not because he had ever met her, but because Delaney Ashford had been photographed on the covers of 2 financial publications in the past year alone, and her face carried the same quality in person that it did in print, composed, alert, and operating behind a careful reserve that most people mistook for coldness. The 2 men beside her were Julian Carrington and Colin Wexler, names Owen also knew, though he had no particular interest in the internal politics of a $30 billion conglomerate, and he turned back to his salmon and tried to review the contract he would no longer be paid to examine. It was the details that pulled his attention back across the room, because details are what a man trained to read documents notices when a room stops adding up. Delaney's phone sat inside a small security pouch on Julian's side of the table, not hers, and Julian's hand rested near it in the way a person's hand rests near something they have decided belongs to them. A security consultant, identified by his posture, and the ear-mounted receiver stood near the corridor exit without appearing to be waiting for anyone in particular, which was precisely the configuration of a man who had been told to stand there and look casual. The documents placed in front of Delaney were retrieved after no more than a few seconds, as though whoever controlled the meeting had decided she should be allowed to read words but not remember page numbers. Colin Wexler checked his watch 4 times in 9 minutes, the rhythmic anxiety of a man monitoring a deadline he had not set himself. Even the server assignments were wrong. Every approach to the semi-private table came through a single staff member who glanced toward Julian's assistant before setting down so much as a water glass. Delaney was being presented with something she had not negotiated and given a window of time that left no space for deliberation, and Owen had spent enough hours watching people sign documents under pressure to know the difference between a difficult negotiation and a controlled one. When Julian turned to speak quietly with Colin, Delaney reached for the linen napkin beside her water glass, pressed her pen to the fabric, and wrote 4 letters in careful block strokes. She nudged the napkin toward the edge of the table until it fell to the floor, and the server moved immediately to retrieve it. Owen stood up first. Owen did not approach the semi-private table, or raise his voice, or do anything that would convert a quiet intervention into a public incident, because he had learned years earlier that the fastest way to destroy evidence was to turn a controlled situation into a chaotic one. He carried the napkin back to table 15, pressed it flat beneath the cover of the menu, and signaled the floor manager with the specific patience of someone who had once been required to produce results without attracting attention. Simon Ward came to the table with the mild professional concern of a man who had spent 2 decades managing dining rooms full of powerful people, and Owen spoke to him in a low, even tone. He had witnessed something at the semi-private table that concerned him. He was not asking Ward to involve himself in a dispute, and he needed Ward to understand that under no circumstances should the security camera data from that evening be erased or overwritten before it was reviewed by someone with legal authority to request it. Ward's expression did not change in any visible way, but his eyes moved toward the curtained archway and stayed there for a moment longer than courtesy required, and then he nodded once and walked back toward the host station with the unhurried movement of a man who had made a decision. Owen wrote 4 sentences on the back of his receipt, using the pen he kept clipped inside his jacket. The message asked Delaney whether she was free to leave the premises of her own choosing, and it asked her, if the answer was no, to touch her water glass twice when the server next approached her side of the table. He folded the receipt once and carried it himself to the server station, explaining that the cashier had made a calculation error on his bill and needed the corrected total delivered to the table adjacent to the semi-private room. The server he chose was a young man who had spent the entire evening on the main floor and had not exchanged a single glance with Julian's assistant, which was the closest Owen could come to a background check in under 30 seconds. Delaney received the folded receipt with the same stillness she might have given a formal memorandum, read it without changing her posture, and placed her fingers against the side of her water glass, twice at an interval of 3 seconds, clean and deliberate. Owen used the restaurant's landline to notify an emergency reporting line that he was currently present at a witnessed document signing. Displaying characteristics consistent with coercion under time pressure and information restriction, gave his name and his professional license number and the address of the venue, and understood that no authority would arrive in time to stop whatever Julian intended to finalize before 9 o'clock. But a time-stamped record of his observation, filed before any confrontation, would be worth considerably more than anything he could produce afterward. He walked to the curtained archway, pulled the panel aside far enough to be visible, and stepped into the semi-private room with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had every right to be there. He addressed Delaney first, placing the napkin on the table in front of her, and speaking at a volume sufficient for the adjoining tables to register. She had dropped something, and he thought she might want it back. Julian Carrington rose partway from his chair and told the security consultant to remove the intruder, but Delaney looked at the napkin, looked at Owen, and announced in a clear and steady voice that the gentleman was her independent compliance advisor, whom she had requested to join the meeting for a final review before any signatures were executed. The lie was delivered without hesitation and with enough specificity that neither Julian nor Colin could immediately determine whether it might be true, and Owen accepted the introduction and asked to examine the agreement. Reviewing the pages in the order they were handed to him, he registered 4 irregularities. The signature page was printed on a paper stock that did not match the body of the document. The page numbering contained a gap between pages 17 and 19. The bank's notary seal displayed pixel compression consistent with digital reproduction rather than embossed original, and the default notification carried no regulatory filing code corresponding to any active instrument he could verify. He did not announce his findings at the table. He told Delaney only that she should not execute any agreement without independent legal review, that this was his professional recommendation, and that if the agreement was entirely above scrutiny, the presence of one additional witness should cause no inconvenience to anyone. Julian could not press further without converting a private pressure campaign into a publicly witnessed confrontation, and Delaney stood and stated that the meeting was concluded for the evening. Owen drove a 12-year-old Volvo, and Delaney Ashford did not mention this when she settled into the passenger seat outside Calder House, because the car was moving away from the building, and that was the only thing she required of it at that particular moment. Owen explained his reasoning in short declarative sentences. Her residential security system had been configured by a company whose contract ran through Julian's office. Her primary phone had been in Julian's physical possession for the past 2 hours, and returning to any property or network that Julian's team could monitor was not advisable until they had established what had actually been prepared and by whom. He pulled into a parking space behind a commercial printing shop on a street that smelled of toner and old brick, climbed a single exterior staircase, and unlocked the door to Barrett Verification's 2-room office on the 2nd floor of a building that looked like nothing in particular, which had always been one of its advantages. Delaney sat across from a desk covered in labeled file folders and described, without prelude, the architecture of the crisis that had been assembled around her. 3 weeks earlier, Julian had presented the board with a financial summary showing the company operating at a $900 million shortfall in its working capital accounts, followed within 48 hours by a notice from the primary lending institution informing the company that it would be considered in breach of its credit covenant at 9 o'clock the following morning. The board had prepared a motion to suspend Delaney on grounds of financial mismanagement, and the agreement placed before her at the restaurant would transfer her voting rights to Julian for a period of 90 days, sufficient time for him to authorize the sale of the energy division to a buyer whose identity she had not been shown. While refusing her access to her legal counsel throughout the entire evening, citing Maeve Hollis as unavailable due to a personal matter that Maeve herself had never been informed of. Owen listened without interrupting, which was not an easy discipline when the pattern being described was structurally identical to 3 separate coercion schemes he had documented during his years with the State Financial Commission. He asked Delaney to recite the document reference number printed on the bank's default notice, the sequence she had memorized while the page was briefly in front of her, and the number she provided did not follow the formatting protocol used by the institution named on the letterhead, a discrepancy that was not the kind of mistake a large bank's compliance department made on official correspondence. He examined the copy she had photographed on her personal watch before the security pouch was applied, noted the seal printed in the upper right corner, and identified a serration pattern along the inner border that matched the output profile of a high-security laser printer rather than the wet-stamped embossing used on authenticated bank originals. Delaney offered him a consulting fee structured as an emergency retainer, and he declined the first iteration and the second and the third until she said that if no verified evidence reached the appropriate authorities before Monday morning, 12,000 employees would arrive at work on the first day of a liquidity crisis that had been manufactured specifically to remove the one person in the organization who had not agreed to participate in it. Owen accepted the engagement on 3 conditions stated without preamble. She would withhold no documentation from his review. He reserved the right to withdraw if his investigation revealed that she had participated in any of the conduct under examination, and every piece of evidence gathered would be surrendered to regulatory authority rather than used as private leverage. When Delaney agreed to all 3 conditions and Owen opened his archived case files to begin cross-referencing, He found the name he had spent 6 years trying not to think about. 6 years earlier, Owen had been a senior investigator for the Illinois Financial Oversight Commission, assigned to review contracting practices at a logistics subsidiary of Ashford Meridian, following an anonymous tip from an accounts payable clerk. What he found over 9 weeks of document review was systematic and deliberate. Maintenance service contracts worth a combined $43 million had been awarded to 7 vendor companies that shared 3 characteristics: no employees in any public registry, no office addresses corresponding to functional commercial properties, and all 7 incorporated within an 18-month window by the same registered agent operating out of a post office box in suburban Milwaukee. The money moved through and disappeared into a layered structure of pass-through entities that Owen had mapped on a whiteboard, covering an entire wall of the Commission's conference room. And his report ran to 112 pages and concluded with a formal recommendation for criminal referral. The report was never forwarded to the state attorney general. Instead, Owen received a notice informing him that his investigation had exceeded its authorized scope, that his methodology had been found inconsistent with commission standards, and that a review of his professional conduct had been initiated at the request of the affected company's legal department. Within 4 months, his investigator's license had been placed under a supervisory hold. 3 of his existing clients had terminated their contracts citing information they declined to specify, and a brief summary circulated through industry channels described him as an employee whose conclusions had been found to be motivated by an undisclosed grievance against the company rather than by documented evidence. The name on the authorization letter that had initiated that process was Delaney Ashford, then serving as Executive Vice President of Strategic Operations. Owen told her what he had found in the archive, and the office became quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something irrevocable has been said aloud. Delaney did not reach for the explanation that would have been most convenient, that she had been younger, that she had not understood the implications, that she had trusted the people around her to give her accurate summaries, because none of those explanations was wrong and none of them was sufficient, and she understood the difference. She said that she had signed a document prepared by Julian Carrington's office without reading the underlying report it described, and that the outcome of that decision had damaged a person's livelihood and professional standing, and that she had not known about that outcome until she was already CEO and had come across a routine audit query referencing the incident by file number. She said she had been careless with the instrument of her authority, and that carelessness with authority was a particular kind of failure because it allowed the person who exercised it to maintain the fiction that they had not intended the harm. Owen also noted that the ghost vendor structure in his 6-year-old report was architecturally identical to the contracting irregularities that would explain where $900 million in working capital had gone. Julian had not invented a new method. He had continued using the same one at greater scale because the original investigation had been neutralized before it could establish a precedent. Owen pulled the portable spectrometer from the equipment cabinet, examined the photograph of the signature page, and confirmed what he had suspected at the restaurant. The page had been printed on a device operating at a different resolution than the pages preceding it, and the micro-tracking dots embedded in the output carried a printer identification code that he logged for later verification, a code that, when traced, pointed directly to a printer located somewhere inside Ashford Meridian's own building. Julian Carrington issued a statement at 11 o'clock the following morning announcing that Delaney Ashford was taking a brief medical leave and that the board would convene in the afternoon to discuss interim governance measures. A statement that was technically accurate in no respect, but was structured to be difficult to refute in the time available. Delaney read it on Owen's laptop, stood up from the chair she had not left since 2 in the morning, and said that if the board assembled without her present, the narrative Julian was constructing would calcify into institutional record before anyone with authority to challenge it could produce a counter-argument. Owen agreed that remaining absent was not an option, changed his shirt in the office bathroom, and accompanied her across town in the Volvo because her own car had not been where it was supposed to be when they left Calder House the night before. They entered the building together, and Owen noticed the precise moment when every executive on the trading floor registered his presence and performed the same rapid calculation. Off-the-rack jacket, no visible credential, walking beside the woman who was supposed to be on medical leave. Colin Wexler met them at the elevator bank and described Owen as a disgruntled former investigator whose antagonism toward the company was a matter of documented record, a characterization delivered in the tone of a man who had rehearsed it, and Owen did not engage with the characterization because the appropriate response to a prepared attack is not a prepared defense but a request for documentation. He asked Colin to provide the current cash position broken down by subsidiary account, the board minutes from all meetings that had authorized intercompany fund transfers in the past 18 months, a full vendor register with payment histories, the printer access log for the executive floor for the past 30 days, and the original bank correspondence rather than the PDF summaries circulated to board members. And Colin produced nothing. Owen noted that the $900 million shortfall had not resulted from operating losses. The capital had been transferred in tranches to a series of escrow accounts registered under names that would not immediately suggest a connection to any individual on the board, recorded in the company's books as expenditures against vendor services that had been neither requested nor delivered, and drawn down by an entity incorporated 2 years earlier in a state with minimal disclosure requirements. One company name appeared with sufficient frequency to constitute a pattern. North Ember Holdings had received payments totaling more than $200 million from Ashford Meridian subsidiaries over a 22-month period, despite having no employees, no commercial office address, and no operating history in any searchable registry. The registered address for North Ember Holdings was a suite number inside a building that belonged to the Carrington family office, and Owen stated this quietly and without inflection, which was more effective than stating it loudly would have been, because a quiet statement invites the room to fill the silence with its own conclusions. Julian's response was that the connection was a coincidence of address management, and that any suggestion of impropriety was exactly the kind of motivated distortion one would expect from a person with Owen's history. He was composing himself very carefully, which Owen noted, because careful composition under pressure is the behavioral signature of someone who has already decided what version of events they intend to survive the day. Harper Lane, Delaney's chief of staff, passed a folded note across the conference table containing a single line of data. The executive floor printer had generated the bank default notice during a window when Delaney's access credentials had logged into the document management system, despite the fact that Delaney had been delivering remarks at a 3-day infrastructure conference in New York, with a timestamp program listing her as the opening speaker. Someone had used her authentication information to generate a false document inside her own building while she was standing at a lectern in another city, and the system had flagged Owen as the unauthorized user, despite the fact that he had not touched a company server. The security team, acting on instructions from Julian that invoked the company's internal protocol for unauthorized data access, escorted Owen from the building at 4:17 in the afternoon on the grounds that his retrieval of proprietary financial records constituted a breach of information security policy, a charge that would have been more persuasive if Owen had actually touched a company server rather than reviewing documents that Delaney had authorized him to examine in her presence. He did not resist the escort, because the timestamp of the removal was being recorded by 3 separate security cameras, and that record would be more useful than any argument he might make in the lobby. By the time Owen reached the sidewalk, a financial outlet had already posted a 3-paragraph item noting that a former state investigator with a documented complaint history against Ashford Meridian had been removed from the building while accompanying the suspended CEO. Someone had prepared the press notification before the escort even began. That evening, Owen returned to his office, made coffee, and called Piper. His daughter was staying with her aunt in the western suburbs and had been told only that her father was handling a complicated professional matter requiring his full attention for a few days, and she told him about a history paper and a disagreement with a friend and a movie she had watched twice because the ending surprised her both times, and he told her he would be at the recital on Saturday and that she should go to sleep at a reasonable hour, which she informed him was something only parents who had never been teenagers believed was possible. Delaney had heard the latter portion of the conversation through the open doorway and said nothing immediately, which Owen respected, because people who say something immediately after overhearing an intimate moment are usually performing having been moved rather than actually being moved. But when she did speak, she told him that her father had issued the same instruction about never showing fear in public for as long as she could remember, and that the practical consequence of that instruction applied consistently across 20 years of professional life was that she had never learned to ask for help until the only instrument available was a linen napkin and a borrowed pen. Owen said that the act of writing the word was not the failure. The failure would have been continuing to sit at the table under the assumption that managing the appearance of control was equivalent to exercising it. Then his phone registered an incoming call from a number he did not recognize, and the voice on the other end belonged to Julian Carrington, who spoke with the particular precision of a man who had decided to stop hiding what he wanted. The offer was $5 million wired to an account of Owen's choosing, restoration of his investigator's license through a letter of professional rehabilitation that Julian's office would prepare and submit, a long-term advisory retainer at a rate that would make Barrett verification financially secure for a decade, and a fully funded educational account for Piper Barrett established in whatever institutional name Owen preferred. In exchange, Owen would provide a signed statement affirming that Delaney Ashford had fabricated the circumstances of her distress at Calder House in order to construct a favorable narrative for a dispute she had initiated against her own board. Owen forwarded the call to his recording application before the second sentence finished, said nothing until Julian was done, declined without elaboration, and sent the audio file and the subsequent written version that arrived by email to the encrypted archive he maintained for materials he intended to present to a regulatory body. 20 minutes later, a financial outlet published documents showing that Barrett Verification had received 3 payments from a company identified as a competitor of Ashford Meridian, and when Delaney saw the account number on the documents and began to waver, Owen recognized what was happening and left the building. After Owen departed, Delaney spent 40 minutes reviewing the financial records that had been published, examining the account routing information against the registration data she could access, and discovered in the 41st minute that the receiving account's tax identification number differed from the one registered to Barrett Verification by 3 digits, a discrepancy invisible to a journalist working under deadline pressure, but not invisible to anyone who checked the underlying registration data. The company that had received the payments had been incorporated 4 months earlier under a name designed to appear in a headline or search result, functionally identical to his. She walked to his office building and knocked, and when he did not open the door, she sat down on the landing at the top of the exterior staircase and waited because there was nothing else available to her at that moment that would have been more honest. He opened the door 40 minutes later, not because he had decided to, but because Simon Ward called at that moment with news that changed the sequence of everything. Ward had done exactly as Owen asked on the night of the dinner, backing up the camera data to a secondary system before Julian's assistant arrived the following morning to request its deletion. The footage showed Delaney's phone being removed from her possession and placed inside a security pouch at the table. It showed a staff member switching the final pages of the agreement during a moment when Delaney was looking at Colin Wexler. It showed the original server who would have retrieved the napkin being redirected by Julian's assistant before Owen could reach it. It showed Colin Wexler sending a text message in the moment immediately after Owen stepped into the semi-private room, and it showed Julian making a gesture toward the vehicle bay that corresponded exactly with the disappearance of Delaney's car from its parked position. The footage established that Delaney had been deliberately isolated, that the document had been altered in her presence, and that the situation had been coordinated across multiple actors with assigned roles. But it did not establish the financial fraud, because a restaurant camera does not record a wire transfer. Maeve Hollis made contact that same evening through a method that suggested she had been waiting for an opportunity that did not route through any system Julian's team could monitor. She had not attempted to reach Delaney directly because she had assumed, correctly, that every communication channel available to Delaney had been compromised from the moment Julian decided to move, and she had been waiting for an external actor to enter the situation. Someone whose communications were not routed through the company's infrastructure. She arrived at the office with a document case containing certified copies of 4 categories of material. The original board minutes from every meeting at which fund transfers had been discussed, bearing signatures that could be compared against the altered versions Julian had circulated. The legal opinion Maeve had prepared opposing the voting rights transfer, which had been suppressed and replaced with a summary characterizing it as tentative rather than definitive. A duplicate of the investigative report Owen had submitted to the State Commission 6 years earlier, obtained from the Commission's own sealed archive through a discovery request she had filed 3 weeks before the dinner, and the internal authorization documents showing that Julian Carrington had directed both Maeve's suspension and Harper Lane's reassignment on the afternoon of the dinner, hours before any official board action had occurred. Owen's original report had recommended criminal referral. The version Delaney had been given recommended administrative review because 2 pages of the conclusion had been replaced before the summary ever reached her desk. Maeve also told them that Delaney had quietly requested a formal reopening of Owen's case through the commission 3 weeks before the dinner, acting on her own initiative after a procurement audit flagged the same vendor structure he had originally identified. She had not yet been able to tell him because she was still building the evidence chain she needed before she could say it with certainty. Owen sat with this for a long moment, and then they agreed on what had to happen next. Handbitter. The emergency board session was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning and structured to be witnessed, which was Julian's design and ultimately his miscalculation, because a proceeding observed by shareholders and institutional investors requires a standard of evidence that a private dinner does not. The room at the top of Ashford Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides and a video feed running to the monitors of 47 institutional accounts holding significant positions in the company, and Julian presented his case in 3 organized segments that moved from financial data to behavioral assessment to governance necessity with the practiced fluency of someone who had rehearsed the sequence many times. He presented the $900 million shortfall as a fact established by independent audit. He presented Owen's prior investigation and removal from the building as evidence of a coordinated attempt by a hostile actor to destabilize the company's leadership, and he presented the napkin with its 4 handwritten letters as documentation of a chief executive operating in a state of psychological distress incompatible with the responsibilities of the position, inviting the board to consider what it communicated about the company's leadership culture, that its highest officer had responded to a challenging negotiation by writing a distress signal on dining linen and passing it to a stranger. Delaney did not dispute that she had written the word. She said that she had written it because she was sitting across from an agreement that her legal counsel had been prevented from reviewing in a building where the exit was monitored by personnel she had not hired, holding a phone she had not been permitted to retain, and that writing the word was not evidence of incapacity but of clarity, because she had understood exactly what was being done to her and had used the only instrument available to communicate that understanding to someone who existed outside the controlled environment. Owen was present as an independent witness, not an employee, not an ally under any contract, not a party with anything to gain from the outcome of the proceeding except the restoration of a professional record that had been damaged by a document prepared inside this very building. He presented the physical evidence in the sequence he had organized it, which was not the most dramatic sequence, but was the most coherent one. Paper stock analysis of the signature page, printer identification traceable to the executive floor, access log data showing Delaney's credentials active in New York during the period the default notice was generated, corporate registration data linking North Ember Holdings to the Carrington family office address, wire transfer records for the fictitious entity incorporated 4 months earlier, and the restaurant camera footage documenting the coordination of the evening in detail. For each item, Owen stated plainly what the evidence showed, what it could not conclusively establish on its own, and what additional verification would be required to close the remaining gap, because the value of a factual record is in its accuracy, and a single overclaim gives the opposing party a thread to pull. Julian argued that the entirety of the evidence package could have been fabricated by parties with a financial interest in destabilizing the board, and that the board should reserve judgment until an independent forensic firm completed a full review, a reasonable procedural request that happened to require several weeks, during which Julian would retain the interim authority he had been maneuvering to acquire. Owen acknowledged that the board should absolutely conduct its own verification, stated that the appropriate interim action was to place the evidence in escrow with regulatory authority rather than in the custody of any party to the dispute, and then Maeve Hollis entered the room with 3 sealed document boxes and a notary certification dated 4 years earlier, and the character of the meeting changed entirely. The sealed boxes contained the original board resolutions authorizing the series of fund transfers that had created the apparent shortfall, and the resolutions bore a signature that every person in the room recognized, because it appeared on the company's founding documents, on the original articles of incorporation, on the framed charter hanging in the reception area of the executive floor. The handwriting of Robert Ashford, who had died 4 years and 3 months before the resolutions in question had supposedly been signed. Owen walked through the specific technical findings with the measured patience of someone who understood that the goal was comprehension, not performance. The ink composition of the disputed signatures contained a synthetic binding agent that had not been present in commercial pen ink of any major manufacturer until 2 years after the date printed on the documents. The paper stock carried a batch identifier in its watermark corresponding to a production run completed 18 months after Robert Ashford was buried. The signature itself, examined under magnification, showed the pressure variation pattern of a traced reproduction rather than a naturally executed original. The pen had followed an existing line rather than created a new one, producing a consistency of width and angle that human handwriting does not sustain across an entire name, and the subsidiary accounts referenced in the final clauses of each resolution had been opened 22 months after the resolutions that supposedly authorized their creation. Julian said that the documentation had been tampered with by parties who had access to archival materials and the technical capability to alter them, an argument requiring the board to believe that Owen Barrett had spent the past 48 hours forging 4-year-old notarized documents while simultaneously evading ejection from the building and conducting a parallel financial analysis. Colin Wexler, who had been silent through the previous hour, understood in that moment that Julian intended to place the full weight of the scheme on the person who had operated the accounts, and that this willingness to do so was not a surprise but was still a distinct and clarifying unpleasantness to experience in a room full of witnesses. Colin provided his administrative credentials to the escrow account system before anyone asked him to, and the data accessed through those credentials showed the fund movement in 3 stages. Operating capital transferred from primary accounts in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flagging thresholds, reclassified as vendor service expenditures in the accounting system, and drawn down by North Ember Holdings and 4 related entities over a period of 22 months. $912 million total, none of it gone, all of it sitting in accounts Julian controlled through nominee structures, available to be returned after the voting rights transfer was executed and the energy division sale was completed at the undervalued price that Carrington family funds were positioned to pay. The bank's institutional representative, connected by telephone, confirmed that no default notice had been issued by the institution, that the company's credit facility was operating within all covenant parameters, and that the document Julian had presented at the dinner was not a record generated by the bank. Delaney stood before the board after the technical presentation was complete and did not offer a defense of her leadership or an attack on Julian's character, because both responses would have made the next thing she needed to say easier to dismiss. She acknowledged instead that she had signed a document prepared by someone she trusted without reading the underlying report it described, had allowed a single advisor to accumulate a degree of access that no governance structure should permit, and had operated within a culture of controlled silence that she had not examined because she had been too invested in appearing to have everything managed. 6 months later, Ashford Meridian looked substantially different in its internal structure, if not in its public profile, which was Delaney's deliberate choice. The reforms were systemic rather than cosmetic, designed to change the conditions that had allowed one person to accumulate unchecked authority rather than to generate favorable coverage about accountability. An independent audit committee reported directly to a subset of the board that excluded any member with a financial relationship to the Carrington family. A whistleblower protection protocol had been written into the employment framework and reviewed by external counsel, and the voting trust documents that connected board control to family governance had been restructured to eliminate the mechanism Julian had intended to exploit. Every vendor contract above a threshold amount was now subject to third-party verification before funds were disbursed, and the firm contracted to conduct that verification was Barrett Verification, operating under an engagement letter that explicitly granted Owen the right to report findings to regulatory authority without seeking approval from anyone inside the company's management structure. Owen had not accepted an internal position, declining each time the offer came through separate channels. Not because he was performing indifference, but because a compliance function has value only when the person performing it has nothing to gain from a favorable finding, and a salary from Ashford Meridian would have compromised the independence that made his work worth the contract price. Barrett Verification's client roster had grown to 11 companies in the months following the board session, partly because the public record of what he had documented and how he had documented it constituted a more effective professional introduction than anything he could have placed in a directory. Piper attended the office opening with a box of cookies she had made herself, wearing the expression of a 14-year-old who is simultaneously proud of her father and slightly embarrassed to be seen being publicly proud of her father, which Owen thought was about the most accurate reflection of their relationship he had ever observed in a single facial expression. Delaney had not attempted to insert herself into the domestic architecture of Owen's life, which he noticed and respected because the instinct to repair through generosity is not always distinguishable from the instinct to manage through it. She spoke with Piper for 8 minutes at the office, opening the way a person speaks with someone whose world they are genuinely curious about, rather than politely acknowledging, and the professional relationship between Delaney and Owen had produced over 6 months, something that neither of them had tried to name, partly because naming it would have required examining it, and examining it would have required admitting that the particular quality of attention they paid each other in a room was not exclusively professional in character. She chose Calder House for dinner, and she asked for table 15, and neither of them mentioned the last time they had been in the building simultaneously. They talked about Piper's school, about an infrastructure project under consideration, about a book Owen had read twice without fully understanding the ending, and about how to spend a weekend in a city when you have lived in it long enough to stop being a tourist and not long enough to stop noticing things. Toward the end of the evening, Delaney picked up her pen and wrote one word on the napkin, then pushed it across the table. The word was not what it had been the last time a napkin had passed between them at this address. It was a question, 4 letters, ending with a mark that turned a statement into an invitation. Owen turned the napkin over and wrote his answer on the back, and the answer was yes, with one condition appended that made her laugh for the first time that had nothing to do with winning anything. When they walked out of Calder House onto the street, they were not a billionaire CEO and a single father from table 15. They were 2 people who had been shaped by loss and error and the particular stubbornness of those who refuse to let either be the final word, beginning something new at the only pace that lasts.